the power forward, a position that can often be forgotten about in NBA discussions, especially all-time ones. Because pretty much every other position has a major narrative or major stars behind it. By comparison, the center position, you've got so many stories from even back in the Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell days to dominant guys like Shaquille O'Neal, who are still so popular today, and the resurgence of that position lately with guys like Nikola Jokic. The point guard, that's always going to be perceived as very important because they are the orchestrator of the offense, and you've got guys like Magic Johnson, Steph Curry. And for shooting guard and small forward, you've got the two greatest players of all time. At the shooting guard position, you got Michael Jordan. At small forward, you've got LeBron James. And the power forward position in itself has a top 5 player of all time, in my opinion. But in general, it is the primary position that can be forgotten about because of often the lack of narrative surrounding it. And even today, one of the best players in the league in Giannis Antetokounmpo is a power forward. But beyond that, the list kind of falls. And in every other position, there are seemingly more top-tier guys at the point guard, Luka Doncic, Curry. And especially at center, the big man position alongside the power forward, that is Jokic, Joel Embiid. That position is really having a renaissance. And so even nowadays, the power forward position can kind of get forgotten about. But as great as Giannis is, he's probably the 4th best power forward of all time. And the notable thing about this position is that the top 3 players to ever be a power forward, they played during the same era in NBA history. They all played together at the same time. And we're going to dive deep into each of those players today. Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. And this is when the 3 best power forwards in NBA history played at the same time. We're going to go into each individual player's story and what their all-time legacy is as a result of their accomplishments and their impact on the court. Let's start off with Kevin Garnett, the big ticket. He starts off his career in Minnesota, and that's where he's really at the peak of his powers. And Anthony Edwards is making his own claim to it right now, but as of the current day and age, Kevin Garnett is the greatest Minnesota Timberwolf of all time, and that is a franchise that has not had many storied players in their history. Top 3 is probably Cat, Kevin Garnett, and Anthony Edwards. And for Garnett, he was really a one-man show over in Minnesota. As the big ticket, he was really the main reason for some Timberwolves tickets. The main reason people would want to go is to see what KG could do night in, night out. And he impacted both ends of the floor very well. He was a great offensive center, but an even better defender. From 2001 to 2005, he had a great peak stretch, averaging 23 points, 5 assists, and 13 rebounds, whilst being an all-time NBA defender, one of the best ever. And if he was in a more competent situation, especially early on in his career, like when he was at his peak from 01 to 05, he would probably be considered top 10 if he went anywhere else with a competent front office. You go back to his 03-04 MVP season, he carried that Minnesota Timberwolves team, and they would have been lost without Kevin Garnett, and that really shows his impact, especially early on in his career. But ultimately, NBA fans, they remember the winners, and he was not able to win in Minnesota. So for some people may remember him better as a Boston Celtic. He leaves the Minnesota Timberwolves, he goes over to the Celtics, and is a key piece of the 08 Celtics team. And the counting stats are down a little bit, but Kevin Garnett is perhaps playing some of the best basketball of his career still, because ultimately he doesn't have to carry on that offensive load they did back in Minnesota. Now he's got guys like Paul Pierce, Ray Allen to kind of take that away from him a little bit, and he hones in on his defense and becomes an even better defender. And that's already a very high floor, if you can even call it that, but he takes it to another level in Boston, and he goes and wins a ring in Boston, showing that he can be a winning player in the right situation. It's just that Minnesota wasn't the right situation. And if it wasn't for his issues with some management over in Minnesota, his number 21 would absolutely be in the rafters, and deservedly so. And can't forget his trash talk. Kevin Garnett is one of the best trash talkers of all time. That's one of the main things that comes to mind when you talk about Kevin Garnett. And that's just kind of, an intangible ability to get inside the opponent's head that can really affect the course of a game. Ultimately, it may not decide the outcome, but it can also sure make for some great stories. But with Kevin Garnett, it really shows the bias that towards winning that both media and public perception can have on a player, because ultimately he only had one ring, and all that time in Minnesota was to no avail, really, postseason-wise. Typically, they weren't able to do much there because KG didn't have a huge supporting cast. They had a good run back in his MVP season, but ultimately he just didn't have the best supporting cast around him. But if he went to a more confident front office early on in his career, he could have multiple rings. He is that kind of player that can impact winning at the highest level, especially because of his two-way ability. And he is without a doubt a top 3 power forward of all time. And with that, we can move on to our next player, and that is Dirk Nowitzki. While Kevin Garnett was known for his two-way ability and especially his magnitude on the defensive end, Dirk, however, was an offensive powerhouse for the Dallas Mavericks. He is definitively the best shooting big man ever, and the only player that is even close to him is Karl-Anthony Towns. But the thing about Cat is he's arguably a better three-point shooter than Dirk, but what he has not mastered is the mid-range, and that is what Dirk was the king of. His fadeaways especially are iconic. The Mavs even honored Dirk by having his fadeaway on their court once he retired. And it's a signature move up there with Michael Jordan's iconic dunk. That is, of course, the face of the whole Jordan brand. Dirk was up there because his fadeaway was so pretty, and not only was it pretty, it was very, very effective. And he was really ahead of his time as an elite shooting big. He probably would have been even better in the modern NBA here in 2024. But the fact that he was able to do what he did back in an era where the NBA was at a really, really slow pace, that's super impressive, and just yet another testament to Dirk. And that mid-range in itself has become somewhat of a lost art in the modern NBA. Really, the only guys that are doing it effectively night in, night out are guys like Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and DeMar DeRozan. But it's not necessarily seen as a viable winning strategy anymore, especially with the rise of the three-point shot. But Dirk, he was able to make it effective. And you go back to his legendary championship run back in 2011, that can be a shining example of that. This was the first season of LeBron James with the Miami Heat, that big three, where anything but a championship is going to be a disappointment for that Miami Heat team. They've got Dwayne Wade still, perhaps their all-time greatest player. They added LeBron James and Chris Bosh. LeBron James is perhaps the best player in the entire league. Not perhaps, the best player in the entire league, and Chris Bosh is a very, very good big man in his own right. And that is one of the best big threes of all time. But Dirk takes this Mavs team that had no right being there, and they don't just go to the NBA championship, they win against a Miami Heat team that was going to be disappointed by anything but a championship. And Dirk Nowitzki only has one ring. But that is one of the best finals runs of all time. And he was, without a doubt, the leader of that Dallas Mavericks team, the primary orchestrator on offense. Really carried a ton of the offensive workload. And that ring is arguably credited more than a guy like Kevin Durant's 2 rings because of just all the circumstances around it. KD, he went to the Golden State Warriors. After the Thunder blew a 3-1 lead to them, he won 2 rings over there. That gets criticized a lot. But Dirk, with his 1 ring, that really catapulted him to NBA legend status because of the way that it was done, the iconic finals run that he led the Dallas Mavericks to, and he was surely ahead of his time as a great shooting big. But at the same time, he was able to use that mid-range effectively in an era of really slow pace and be an offensive juggernaut. Dirk is without a doubt an all-time great, the best shooting big man in NBA history, has one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic, finals run for a player in NBA history, and absolutely deserves his place at the top three power forwards of all time. And that brings us to our last player, Tim Duncan, the big fundamental. Perhaps him being the best power forward of all time and a top five player kind of could be the reason why the power forward isn't discussed in NBA circles more. Because Tim Duncan, in terms of his play style, he wasn't the most exciting player to watch, and for a lot of people, that can turn them off of his game. But he impacted the game like no one else. And that San Antonio Spurs team, as a dynasty, owes a huge favor to Tim Duncan, because he oversaw many errors of that team and fit in seamlessly every time. He played very well alongside David Robinson. Then, of course, there were the Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker teams. And then in 2013, when he wasn't quite the same player anymore, they gave more of the offensive workload to this young Kawhi Leonard. And Tim Duncan is still able to be an effective player on that team with a little bit less of a workload. And they win once again. 5 championships for Tim Duncan, one of the greatest defenders, if not the best defender in NBA history. So many accolades, all defensive teams, all stars, all NBAs. And he did it in a way that, it wasn't flashy, but it was in a way where you couldn't argue with what he was doing on the court, because so often, especially now with highlight culture and social media, a player can be perceived as much better than they are just for some flashy passes that they'll make for their highlight reel plays, when ultimately that is not equivalent to the value that they are bringing on the court night in, night out, and even, possession in, possession out. They can take off some plays and then, have a great alley-oop the next, and that's all that people are going to see. So for a player to be the antithesis of that, and Tim Duncan to do nothing flashy, but impact the game regardless in every way possible, that's even greater, because you don't have necessarily the media eyes on you all the time, the public opinion on you all the time. They're not tuning in necessarily to watch what highlight Tim Duncan is going to have. They're tuning in to watch how Tim Duncan is going to impact winning basketball, and that is the greatest thing that he can do. And in doing that, Tim Duncan is kind of the role model for the power forward and its position all time. It's not necessarily flashy. It doesn't always keep up with the trends. You look at Giannis today, he's not a floor spacer when the NBA is taking more threes than ever. Giannis is not. You look at Dirk, he revolutionized the game, and is the best shooting big man ever, an offensive juggernaut in an era where the pace was quite slow. And Tim Duncan is once again the model of that. The power forward position does not seek out highlights every night. They aren't the most exciting players to talk about. They aren't perceived as the most important position on the court, but they can impact the game like no other when it comes to an all-time great. And that is the beauty of the power forward position. And those are the top 3 power forwards of all time: Dirk Nowitzki, Kevin Garnett, and Tim Duncan. And Tim Duncan, once again, he really sets the tone for that power forward position. It can so often kind of be forgotten about in discussions, but regardless, it is still super important. And when they're on, there's no stopping them. When they're great, there's no one else in the league like them. You can even go back to before this era of the best 3 power forwards in NBA history. Before that, you had Charles Barkley, who in his own right, he wasn't very tall to be a big man, but he became an MVP and an all-time great rebounder in spite of that. The power forward position doesn't follow the rules that are in place in the NBA. They like to go their own way, and it creates an impact, especially on winning basketball, that cannot be outdone by chasing trends, by teams trying to create a new identity to follow those trends, like the Houston Rockets 2018 era James Harden era, trying to follow the Golden State Warriors lead of taking all those threes. Ultimately, it didn't work out for them. Teams love to chase trends and they love to seek out new identities and try to do all that they can to win. But that power forward position stands out as an outlier for what they can do on the court and how effective they can be in spite of the obstacles that they might face. And that is exemplified by the three guys that we've talked about today. Thank you for listening. This has been State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts.